Hello, and welcome to this edition of Herbalism as Activism, stories of healing, justice, resistance, and change. I am your host, Garlic, with the Living Medicine Project. You can check out past episodes at my website at livingmedicineproject.com/herbalism-as-activism, or by going to the Herbalism as Activism Facebook page. In this edition, I interview Stephen Buhner, herbalist, teacher, and prolific author. He's been called an earth poet and a bardic naturalist, and I'm not sure either of those fully capture him. And this interview is a particular honor for me because I've had the opportunity to study with Stephen, and he's had an enormous impact on me and my healing journey and what it is that I teach in my profession now in the world. So thank you, Stephen. In this interview, we explore the age-old question of what do Donald Trump, Hurricane Katrina, the mortgage meltdown, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and Lyme disease have in common. It turns out they're all symptoms of the end of the age of reason and rationality.
The thing they left out is that reason divorced from the other human attributes that we have becomes pathological almost immediately. It has no moral compass.
We also get a bit of a history lesson from Stephen about the emergence of this new herbal renaissance in the U.S. over the last 100 years or so. It's a kind of long interview because around the 45-minute mark, we shifted into talking more personally and less just about these large concepts, and Stephen began sharing some of his personal stories about his transition into elderhood, his own healing journey, and some of his personal plant allies, and I just couldn't edit any of it out. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Stephen Buhner.
While I watch the madness of the world below, and she laughs and tells me that it's temporary, underneath the wild garden waits to grow.
All right, welcome, Stephen. And yeah, thank you so much for being willing to do this.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. To dive right in, I would love, what I try to do with these interviews is to start with the question of how do you do herbalism as activism?
Well, that's huge. It's funny, I was reading some stuff by James Hillman the other day, and he said, people always come up to me and they say, I just have a quick question, and he goes, well, that's fine, except that I've been thinking about the answers for 40 years, so the answers are always necessarily long ones.
Right.
So, and so, as usual, I always have pre-rambles pretty much about everything that I say, and it was interesting, so to get the pre-ramble on this, I had been convinced by one of my editors almost 20 years ago now to do a book on herbal brewing, and took her a while, but I finally agreed. And then at the time there really wasn't much internet, so she knew this guy who was a beer anthropologist who traveled around the world to all over the place, indigenous tribes in the Amazon, to taste all their beers. And he had one of the world's great beer libraries, and he said, well, when he heard about the project, he said, have him come here, because he's not part of the field, he'll probably be able to do a good book. And that kind of sums up the whole thing. It's like we are in a time of such specialization and of such narrow focus that we tend to be blinded by whatever field we get into, because we sort of absorb the assumptions and the dynamics and of what is supposedly there. And one of the neat things about herbalism, at least when the time I got into it, was that it had really been sort of the neo-herbal movement in North America had been formed by a lot of eccentrics and outriders and people that didn't really fit any place else, and it was coming out of the 60s, and a lot of the people, as a matter of fact, all of them, as far as I could tell, of those early people, had taken a lot of LSD or psilocybin or mescaline or smoked a lot of marijuana, and they sort of had this interesting connection with the plant world because of that. Nevertheless, when I got really into it in the early 80s, the field had kind of started to solidify a bit, but I was coming from very far outside their orientation. I mean, my degree was in epistemology, which is looking at ways of knowing in different cultures, and I'd spent years training in psychotherapy, and so my approach was really kind of different. And as I got into it, you know, and I'm sure you've noticed this, and many people in the herbal world have now, that there is this sort of drive for professionalism, which is what, or they called it that, but what it really was sort of a rigidity of form to try to make themselves more acceptable to the medical world, to sort of fit into that paradigm that we're all pretty much immersed in. And that just wasn't my style. I mean, I sort of played around with it a little bit, like everybody does, but the thing that really is really different for me, I can't really see any discrete boundaries between one thing and the next. To me, herbalism is fundamentally an ecological process, and when you know, I think it was Burroughs, one of the great environmentalists, John Muir, I think it was, that said, when you pull on one thing, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And like many people before me going into the plant world, I began to find that that was true. So one of the big differences for me was really sort of abandoning the hubris of the human orientation and just letting the plants tell me about themselves and how they worked and what they did and all of that. And yeah, there was sort of a grounding in, you know, the older herbalists from throughout history and especially the 19th century. But once you start moving into that world, you start to find that the real world doesn't really quite match the world that human beings, or the fantasy that human beings have created about it. And I think that's one of the things that's really led to so many of the innovations I've been able to contribute to the herbal world, because once you get rid of your preconceptions, there's a lot of fascinating things that begin to emerge that seem almost obvious in themselves. And that's a very different approach to most of the sort of clinical herbal texts or stuff, or even the kitchen herbal texts that have been written. And I think that's really the fundamental difference, is I'm not stuck in a frame and I'm letting the living world of the plants tell me where they want me to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so do you feel that one of the ways that you've expressed your herbalism as activism, or how that's played out in your life, is about kind of holding space for this other way of being, this other way of knowing?
Well, yeah, that's really correct. I mean, there's two elements to that observation question that you've just made. I mean, one of them is simply by choosing to immerse oneself in the herbal world, one begins to, just by mere existence, run into conflict with the dominant reductive medicalistic paradigm that surrounds us every day of our lives. And that forces a lot of self-examination in and of itself. But to even go further, if you start to really experience the plant world as intelligent and alive and constantly adapting and innovating and moving, that there's this constant flow of communication and change running through the ecosystems all of the time, then it gets even more pronounced, because we are at a time that human beings have been through many times before, for various reasons, but we're at a point where one dominant paradigm is failing, it's ending, and a new one is beginning to emerge. So,
and what is that?
We're reaching the end of the age of reason, or rationality, and a lot of people have a knee-jerk thing about what that means, but really what happened is during the Enlightenment, reason or rationality emerged as this sort of counterweight to dogmatic religion, and so this other way of knowing that you didn't have to sort of take things on faith began to emerge. But what the rationalists of our time miss, and most of the people who've been infected by that frame of reference miss, is that during the Enlightenment they didn't throw out intuition or imagination or common sense or the ability of human beings to feel. It was all of those human attributes were still there. They just were using reason as this one kind of approach to sort of give a different view of the world or a different path. But as time has gone on, the people who believe in what they call reason or rationality, they've begun to remove all of those other attributes of our humanity from that field, because they felt like it was corrupting the ability of reason to observe the world. And so the thing they left out is that reason divorced from the other human attributes that we have becomes pathological almost immediately. It has no moral compass. It has no warmth. It has no capacity to love. It's just sort of an organic computing process. And the more that began to happen, the more damage unrestrained reason or dissociated mentation began to do to the world around us, not only the exterior world, but our interior worlds. And so, and you can really see how it's just not working anymore. It's the system itself of thought can't maintain the complexity of the world we're in now, and it's failing everywhere in the Western world. So this dynamic of working with the living reality of things, of having the response of the heart to what's presented to the senses, there's this move into a new kind of paradigm that's emerging. And herbalism is one of those things. I mean, it's like being gay in the 50s. It forces you out of this sort of comfortable framework of culture and into self-examination and to examination of the culture itself and its failings. So yeah, this thing forces a kind of activism. Now, many people are fairly minimal in their activism, but for me it became a primary means or doorway through which to focus my activism in the world. Just at the very most basic level, pharmaceutical medicine is a very bad thing in many ways. Probably 80% of it is quite bad ecologically and just healing-wise. And so I'm looking at more of an ecological form of healing and medicine that's sustainable. But that throws me into immediate conflict with this massive, very rich apparatus that's in the world that sort of dominates everything.
Right. Yeah. So there's two questions that come up for me there, and I'll start with the one, and then maybe I'll backtrack to the other. But I wonder, how do you feel about, because you have this critique of reductive science, and I've learned a lot from it, and I think, the things that you're saying, I also understand as activism, even a form of mental, emotional, spiritual decolonization.
Right.
To see the world as it is, as opposed to through the blinders that we've been trained in. And And at this time, in Trump's America in particular, and the rejection of science and facts from I guess they're being called the alt-right now, but it's just like the buffoonery. Do you find any conflict there in terms of I don't know, overlap or being interpreted as a science denier when you critique reductive science and its lack of a holistic perspective, I guess?
Well, in the early days, before I'd become more sophisticated in my knowledge base and my languaging, I was attacked by a lot of reductive scientists, and even some that weren't quite so reductive, for being anti-science.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a long time to learn how to respond with more, to get away from, well, double dumbass on you, which was my, emotional response at the time. But basically, I'm not anti-science. I'm anti-scientist in a lot of ways. The problem with every field that I've studied, and there's been a lot of them, is that in the beginning there's quite a lot of amazing stuff that happens, but over time the most psychologically damaged members of the movement begin to take over the movement itself. And that's a very common problem. Many people that are into science possess tremendous psychological damage, and I don't think there's anybody I know that hasn't run into sort of the rationalists who deny intuition, or if you try to bring up anything mushy, they become very emotional and enraged and begin spewing this response. So the problem is that science has possessed tremendous problems within it for a very long time. And the way the thing was structured, it wasn't really possible to talk about those limitations without being accused of being anti-science or anti-rationality or whatever. So, in a way, their sort of isolation of that, where they wouldn't accept any sort of feedback, has contributed to this problem now, because everybody, well, not everybody, but certainly a large number of people really know there's something wrong in the world of rationality, in the world of science. So, in a lot of ways, any system can be gamed if you want to game it. And science has been gamed pretty heavily now by a lot of different people. Like, for instance, there's quite a few peer-reviewed journals now that are actually fake, that pharmaceutical companies have created, in which they get journal papers published that appear to be the real deal, but in fact whose only function is to support the use of whatever drug they happen to be selling. And that sort of dynamic, or for instance, modern medicine, or technological medicine as it really should be called, the proponents of that, they think of themselves as being medical scientists, but when you start to get into that world, what you find is there's a lot of self-interest, there's a lot of greed, there's a lot of power control struggles between different groups that then affect what begins to happen. And this is against the background of the proponents of science saying that, well, science is value-free, science is this, science is that. But what's really true, when you get into it, it's not really that different than anything else. So the sort of alt-right attacks on science, it's just an element of the problem that's been arising because scientists themselves were unwilling to police their own field. And that happens all the time. I mean, incredibly extreme fundamentalist Christians began to dominate Christian agenda in the United States, for instance, and moderate Christians wouldn't speak up. And within the herbal world itself, the same things sort of start to happen, that more extreme pockets begin to control the agenda, the way the FDA laws were set up, and a lot of other things. And very few people within the herbal world were willing to confront their compatriots and say, there's a real problem here. So Yeah, I mean, I sincerely doubt anybody would start comparing me to Trump's, the Trumpeteers and their sort of agenda in the alt-right and attacking science, just because of the body of my work is so different than anything they might say. But nevertheless, these sort of assaults on dissociated rationality, no matter its form, they're going to be coming from everywhere now because we're reaching the end of that paradigm as useful. In a way, the easiest way to sum it up is that rationalist science is based, for the most part, on linearity and the belief of control. But nonlinearity is what really happens here, and control is an illusion. So science itself is beginning to undergo a metamorphosis that the younger people coming into it are aware of, but the older guard is holding on as strongly as they can. And it really should collapse, but it's not going to be exactly a pleasant process to move from one paradigm to another. Too much of our infrastructure is based on that old view, and which is really inaccurate.
Willie says, here's a story that you may not comprehend, but the forest here will rise and bloom again. There's a world beneath the pavement.
Hi, this is Garlic, sneaking in with a little word from our sponsor moment. Now, I'm doing this podcast as part of my lifelong work. It's called the Living Medicine Project, weaving together herbal medicine, empathy, and nature connection for personal and community healing. And I'd like to invite you to check out my website and to sign up for my newsletter by going to livingmedicineproject.com. There's a New Here button at the top, or on the top right, there's a spot to add in your name and email address. And if you do that, you'll get a copy of one of my classes, the Heart of Healing webinar. You'll also get to receive emails from me where I'll talk about herbal, healing, and activisty events or classes, and the occasional blog-type teachings or reflections or rants from me. I also want to thank everybody who's supported this podcast so far by listening or sharing or offering reviews or comments. It really nourishes me to know that this project is nourishing you as well. So please don't hesitate to add your 2 cents on the blog or on Facebook, or send me an email or whatever. I'd love to connect with folks who are listening to this and know how it's landing. And with that, we'll go back to the interview.
The seeds are lying dormant, it will never end.
So how do you think, because as I hear you talking about that, I hear this strong parallel with capitalism. And in particular, its emphasis on control and how the state is used on people. And that also seems to be failing,
Well, it is very much. I mean...
Is there a connection there, you see?
Well, yeah, there is a connection because much of reductive science has been co-opted by corporate capitalism. And I want to make a distinction here between entrepreneurial capitalism and corporate capitalism. Entrepreneurial capitalism is extremely important and is deeply related to democracies and cultures, whereas corporate capitalism is totalitarian in its nature, fundamentally so. And it's only if the cultures have really strong limits set on its behavior that it can actually function within a democratic frame of reference. But it's very, very powerful, and it has tremendous amounts of money. And of course, science itself, its sort of, you might say, practical, real-world offspring is technology. And because of how useful technology is to corporate capitalism, corporate capitalist structures have been subsuming science into it more and more and more as time goes on. And there's very few scientists now that aren't somehow subsumed into the corporate frame of reference through patents or through the money they get, in some way their research funding or whatever. So you've seen a huge distortion of the scientific field. There's our idea of the dispassionate scientist who wants to learn, about nature with their fluff of haloed white hair, and they're sort of bemused, framework. Those guys don't exist much anymore. There's a few old ones still around, but most of the scientists now are in many ways technologists who are in it for the money in many respects. And yeah, those two things go hand in hand, just sort of bringing out the worst in each other, really.
Right. And I wonder, do you have any, practical examples about this, the failing of this age of rationality?
Well, a lot. I mean, these examples abound. One of the greatest ones for me is Hurricane Katrina. So here we are, supposedly the most powerful and richest nation on earth, ruled by rationality and, science and technology and engineering and all of this sort of thing. And so Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans, and how long did it take them to get bottled water to the people stuck in the Astrodome or whatever they call that place in New Orleans, the Silver Dome, I guess. Those people were there, 7 days without water, without food, without toilets, without, if it had been left up to just regular people, they would have just driven over and dropped the stuff off. So that when we're faced with crisis, the system fails. For instance, the mortgage meltdown that happened in 2008, rationality, if you were any kind of functional rationality, you would have immediately put limits on the banks. But that's not what happened. I mean, when the bankers met with Obama, I was reading a report by one of them who was in the room that day, and he said, we were terrified. We'd crashed the system, and we were willing to do anything Obama asked us to do. But what he said was, how can we help you?
Right.
And so they flowed all of this money into the banks, but the social structure was damaged because it wasn't addressed. So you begin to see this over and over and over again. Or another point of it is rationality tends to be based, rational behavior, although there's not much of it, but let's go into the illusion for a minute. It's based on certain assumptions about the nature of reality. And if those assumptions are wrong, then no matter how rational the behavior on top of it, it's not going to turn out well. So the belief about bacteria being sort of stupid and, we can create all this stuff through our rationality and science. Well, what actually has happened is the more rationality's been applied to the bacterial world, the more resistant bacterial organisms arise and faster. And so we're facing the threat of these tremendous epidemic plagues that will run through the human population, because the more rationality is applied in that area, the worse the problem gets, because the underlying assumptions are incorrect. So those are just three sort of examples. But what's going to happen is, as the system begins to fail, rationalists are simply going to think that they haven't applied their system more vigorously enough, and they'll begin to apply it even more thoroughly, which will increase the problems even more. So
right.
That sort of gives an example of that.
Thank you for those. Those are really practical ways to look at it. And I'm curious if there are, when you talk about the bacterial resistance, are you talking about MRSA, or are there more than that?
That's just the tip of the iceberg. One of the things you have to realize is that by the time something gets in the newspaper and becomes well known, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You've got this massive thing underneath the ocean surface that very few people can see unless they go deeper, which most people don't. So I'm thinking, when I did the second edition of my book, Herbal Antibiotics, there was something like 20 or 23 bacteria that are extremely infective for human beings that are not responding to antibiotics, and every year more so. So, and it's I quoted in that book some of the world's major bacteriologists and epidemiologists, and there is no conflict in their point of view. Every one of them, without fail, has said the era of antibiotics is over. There's nothing that we can do to stop it. We face the threat of plagues more virulent than any the human species have known before, and we're about to go back to medicine as it was in the 19th century, where even a simple pinprick or minor operation will be extremely dangerous because of the existence of resistant bacteria. So I consider the threat much greater than climate change, but both of them, of course, go hand in hand, and they each feed on the other. So yeah, it's very, very serious. And when I read articles, I've been looking at this for over 20 years, so when I read articles on it, most of them will start off with an accurate view, but they always down at the end throw this little Pollyanna thing in. But yes, if we just simply do this, or if we have more research, or if we do this, it will change the whole thing, and then we can go on as we have before, which is sort of what rationalists always end up saying. If they wrote the article and said we're doomed, people wouldn't respond well. But in fact, it's the paradigm through which the bacterial world that's being viewed that is the problem. And the paradigm has to shift. And that means understanding how incredibly ignorant we are about the world out there. And to begin with, bacteria are highly intelligent. They're tool makers. They have a well-developed language. They have culture. They even make insulated electrical cables to heat some of their cities. Most people don't know this. If you share it, most people don't believe it. But nevertheless, that's what the peer-reviewed journals are saying of the researchers that are working now. And as I like to say, all this information is carefully hidden in open access peer-reviewed journals where people can't find it. But that's what's true, and as long as we treat them differently than that, the problems are only going to get worse.
Right. And so I think that I've heard you talk about pharmaceutical, sort of the whole industry having given up on pursuing more antibiotics, but that seems like we were just talking about how the system sort of reacts, the rationality is defended with more control.
Right,
Is there an end to that control where they just give up? And has that happened?
Well, they're in a really interesting position because there's 2 points to it. One is they don't make very much money on antibiotics. It's virtually the only thing that physicians can do to heal disease, if you want to think about it in that frame of reference. When they're working, somebody gets ill, you figure out what it is, you give them the antibiotic, and, a few days or a few weeks later, they're fine. Pharmaceutical companies make most of their money on drugs that people have to take for a lifetime, like cholesterol-lowering drugs or antidepressants or whatever. So that's their main focus. That's where their money comes from. But they also have recognized the futility of trying to find more antibiotics that will actually address the problem. So what they've done is the vast majority of them have ceased all research and development on new antibiotics. And so what happened is the United States government, recognizing that it's a severe challenge to national security, they've started to do research on it, and it's a win-win for the pharmaceutical companies because they don't make a lot of money off of it. It's going to fail anyway, so it might as well be the government that shoulders the burden of both the cost and the ultimate failure. And the government's not going to stop. They can't afford to, but at the same time, this awareness is starting to emerge that there's not a lot that they can do, so they begin to do things like find some antibiotics that will work, which they then don't use, and which they save to protect the government, are what they consider essential workers later on. And that's sort of a standard dynamic process. But yeah, the system's failing, and the government will spend a lot of time and effort on it, but there's not a lot they're going to be able to do. Sooner or later, the rational system begins to fail, and then at that point, they don't really have much choice except to go into a deep depression, which will force them into a different system of thought. I mean, that's part of the function of depression.
Interesting. And I wonder, do you have any reference material that I might be able to add to the show notes that talks about any of this stuff around the pharmaceutical sort of abandonment of it, or the government?
Oh, sure. In my book, the second edition of Herbal Antibiotics, I actually cite a number of those people in there, and that's all in the reference section of the book. It's not that hard to find. If you just spend a little time on Google Scholar or just even looking at headlines and pursue that sort of thread, you'll start running into that pretty immediately. But I think it's in either the first or second chapter of that book. I quote a number of people extensively.
Oh, okay. I've got the first edition, so I haven't picked up.
No, the second edition's my magnum opus. The first edition was my, sort of floundering around trying to find my way.
I see. Okay, well, I'll check it out. So maybe we can shift gears a little bit, because I'd love to get your perspective on, I guess, kind of like the herbal resurgence that's been going on for the last, 100 or 150 years. I kind of see it as a movement of people, and I wonder sort of what your perspectives are on what that process has been like. And in particular, I'm interested to know, where do you think that's coming from? What's the motivation for so many people to be looking for herbs when it hasn't been totally legal for that whole time?
Well, you have to understand the world changed substantially beginning about 1900. So in the United States, I mean, you're in Canada, but I know the United States history the best, a tiny bit about Canada, a fair amount about England, but in the United States in 1900, there were maybe 12 different kinds of physicians that worked regularly. The homeopaths were by far the most numerous and most effective. But right at that point in time in 1900, so herbalism was getting into a real remarkable stage with the work of John Uri Lloyd in the United States. A lot of neat stuff was happening. But also at the same time, after the Civil War, you have to understand the Civil War in the United States, a massive motivation for it was abolitionism and the desire to end slavery. And there was a lot of activist groups involved in that, composed of various kind of subgroups. But one of them was really sort of women that had time on their hands and ministers and things like that. And so when they were able to the Civil War happens, abolition occurs, slavery is outlawed, those people then were still sort of there. And one of the, or I suppose two of the other closely related areas of activism that they had was one, women having the vote, and another one was their concern about alcoholism and the problems that caused in families, let's say. And so you might just put that under the whole thing of an anti-drug movement, because opium was legal then. Laudanum, which was an opium sort of tincture, was extremely common. And women, working women, that were poor especially, they would add it to babies' milk formulas so that to keep them kind of quiet. And there was a really strong anti-tobacco movement at the time as well. So this sort of movement occurred at the same time that the American Medical Association was wanting to have complete control over medicine in the United States. And they formed a sort of group together that helped the FDA form. And there was a lot of concern about meat production in Chicago and how filthy it was. So there was this social movement that got that created. And at that point, the AMA got control, pharmaceutical companies became dominant, and, the prohibition movement continued to gain steam until alcohol was prohibited in the United States. So this whole thing sort of happened at the same time, and it basically destroyed the herbal movement in the United States. The last herbal college closed in 1932, but they had been falling off rapidly since then. So it was really over, and any sort of public herbal thing was squashed pretty immediately by the AMA. But then this whole new generation emerges after World War II, and the hippies in the 60s, they were different. They were really interested in this stuff. And so, Rosemary Gladstar was one of the first people who really got into it and opened one of the first herbal stores in the United States in California in the mid-60s sometime. And she began teaching, and a lot of the herbal movement came out of those early efforts on her behalf. And so this whole new kind of thing began to emerge, seemingly of its own accord, but it was really in line with a lot of the movements that began there, the desire for organic farming and more hands-on artisan work. And her students taught other students, and some of her students began herbal companies. Most of the herbal companies that we know of now, like Herb Farm, were started by some of her students, in their garages, like, Apple Computers started, and they grew bigger and bigger, and then they taught more people, and those people taught more people. So it was sort of the time, and part of the reason why it was slow at first and then gained steam, but a big part of the motivation was a lot of people going to physicians who were ill who couldn't get any help through that system. Mm-hmm. And of course, the medical system bitterly attacked anybody going outside their frame of reference. But in fact, lowering cholesterol is easy with diet change and with herbs. Improving heart function is easy, and on and on and on, and there's much fewer side effects. So it began gaining steam. But one of the things that you've probably heard me say in the past, that for many years when I was teaching, all around the country, I would ask people, well, okay, now why did you get into herbalism? And the people, I'd say, just tell me, and the answers were invariably something like, I don't know, I just felt like I should. Now, a few of them would say, because I was sick and then I did this and it worked. But the majority of answers were some version of, I don't know, I just felt like I should. And so then I'd say, well, so you're telling me you've spent years of training and thousands of dollars learning a profession that you can't legally practice? And they would say, yes. So to me, that meant there was some other factor involved, something moving through the human species, urging them to take this different path. And I think that's the way that the Earth ecosystem really tends to work. Some sort of movement or emotive force comes out of the system itself. We're not separate from the ecosystem. We're not a different kind of animal. We're just a living being like all of the others that emerged out of this ecological matrix, and in which we're always embedded and from which we can never escape. And ecological patterns and movements and motivations affect us just like everything else. And some deeper thing in the ecosystem or in the human species was urging us to move into different paradigms. And I think you can see that if you begin to look everywhere, because we're just like elephants. We're not that different. Elephants know if an earthquake or a tsunami is about to occur, and they can feel it. And just like them, we sense that there's something wrong in the fabric of our world, that destabilization is occurring, and we all begin to move in response to that. And a huge, massive part of that has been thousands and thousands of people who have trained in herbalism, who are now, disguised as housewives and postal clerks and carpenters and bartenders, and they're all over the place now.
Right. Yeah, it does seem, the classes that I teach, I get a pretty broad spectrum of people from different areas of life who are interested.
And you see it even more. I mean, one of the areas that I've been interested in for a while are stealth infections like Lyme disease or Bartonella or Babesia. That's whole sort of complex of arthropod transmitted infections. And those kind of infections don't respond well to antibiotics. Maybe 60% of the people can be cured with pharmaceuticals, but the other 40%, in their millions, they try the system and it breaks down, and then they turn to herbs sort of in despair. I mean, you've seen this, the herbalist is the last person most people come to see, only when everything else has failed. And so, but as those people get well from using herbal medicine, huge numbers of them now are training in herbal medicine. And so you've got this sort of grassroots thing emerging out of the depths of us to deal with problems that the rationalist system just can't handle. And there's a lot of motivations, but nevertheless there's some force flowing through the human species taking us in a very different direction now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. It does seem to be coming to a climax.
Indeed it is, and we'll see greater and greater, wilder and wilder gyrations of stability, whether it's in politics or economics or ecological dynamics like Hurricane Katrina, increased heat and massive fires and heavy rains. We're in this destabilization period, and our old systems of thinking and behavior are going to fail with greater and greater frequency as time goes on. And I think a lot of people understand this and are responding as best they can. Yeah, on some level, for sure. So, I mean, really, the election of Trump, even though it has all of these dismaying elements to it, part of what that represents is huge segments of the American population trying to break out of the straitjacket of those old patterns of behavior that, don't work for them anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if only they had been given the option of Bernie as a way to
that's really true. And
right?
In a way, I mean, you see this, the liberal forms of government are failing all through Western Europe. They're failing here because they've abandoned the common people. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I have a hyperactive forebrain, but also at the same time, I've worked with my hands for years. I immersed myself in the trades as a woodworker, and so I kind of understand both worlds. And Bernie's one of the few people that was speaking for both worlds, the intellectual elites as well as the common people who work with their hands. And I've been dismayed by the members of my liberal tribe feeling so dismissive of people that live in trailers or work with their hands or live a more simple kind of life, because, it's like I know very, very few people who think of plumbers with any respect, yet our entire infrastructure depends upon plumbing more than anything else. It's like there's some guy, I think his name Gardner or something, who said, in any culture that demeans plumbing as a humble profession and exalts philosophy as a great one is going to end up with both bad plumbing and bad philosophy.
Yeah, I heard this quote, I'm going to get it wrong, but from Krishnamurti. Yeah, that's his name, right? Krishnamurti. The Indian philosopher.
Right.
Where he said the constant reassertion of beliefs is it's a sign of fear, or it's a symptom of fear.
Oh, that's a really nice way of putting it. That really is, and we see that a lot. I mean, Buckminster Fuller said human beings have a monological propensity for one-picture answers. Unfortunately, one-picture answers don't exist in the universe. But as we look around ourselves, and everybody knows that the systems that we've relied upon are fragile and are beginning to decay, so many of them are seizing on one-picture answers, like whether it's everybody should become vegetarian so we could have 10 billion people on the planet, or, whether, we should all quit smoking so we'll live healthy lives, or, that we have to have a really strong military and bomb the shit out of everybody in the world, or, corporate capital. It's like these one-picture answers are emerging from everywhere and everybody's fighting over them, but in fact, it's only a tremendous complexity of response that's going to work for us at this time.
Oh, I just had an insight that might fit here. So I've been studying about how the Ayurveda sort of describes the growth process through the three doshas, and so the young one, the new birth, is considered kapha, midlife is considered pitta, and then older age is considered vata, which is about rigidity and fragility. And it sounds like that's kind of the age of reason and rationality, as you're talking about, is in that rigid, fragile stage.
Well, it is. And I'm, just about to turn 65. And when I hit 63, I started moving into old age. And it's just as significant of a shift as adolescence or midlife, though here in the West we recognize adolescence more, but those others, midlife crisis is sort of laughed at, and an old age crisis, it's where you become useless, essentially. But the thing that I began to go through this really strange process that was shocking to me. So I found myself getting into this really grumpy, sort of bitter, cynical frame of mind where I go, the kids these days, they don't even, blah, 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 what's happened to, like a lot of the old people that I see around. And then, a month later, I'm sitting around going, it's all over. I'm useless. Life is over. I'm just going to be an old person and I can't do anything. And then I found myself running through all of these sort of caricatures of old person. And all of a sudden one day I realized that the soul of me was throwing up all of the options that I had. It was like saying, well, here's a way that you can live the rest of your life. This is what you can be in old age, or here's what you can be in old age, or here's what. But, to get to that other point of sort of being willing to endure the grief and tragedy of the world, but still have this certain kind of warmth of heart and understanding without the sort of hysteria that, is part of the younger time of life, that's a much more difficult thing. And then I started thinking about how in adolescence, all of the different sort of frames of mind that adolescents take on, they're exploring the same sort of thing. And in midlife, it happens again. So your observation is really good in that for cultures, they're living beings just the same way. And they reach this point of where, in a sense, I'd say with America, we're going into midlife, rather, because we're an adolescent culture, and that's what's really thought well of. But as you start to go into this shift and the old frame of reference doesn't work, the same thing happens. We begin to take on, who are we going to be? Are we going to be old men yelling at clouds, or what are we going to do here? And yeah, there's not really we don't have decent myths in this culture for how to become something that we've never been.
Right, because almost to a complete degree, the practice of rites of passage has been removed.
Right, it has, and in part, I think a big part of the pathology of that is the American fear of death. I mean, this culture is terrified of death. They want to defeat it at all costs. And in a lot of ways, even amongst my liberal sort of New Age community, many of them think severe illness is a failing. If we'd only thought better or ate better or taken more care of ourselves, then somehow this debility wouldn't have occurred, and certainly we wouldn't have died till we were at least 120. So, but then if we did die, we'd just all of a sudden go, oh, and I'm passing now, and off you go, right? There's not going to be this long suffering process, And that sort of terror of the destructuring of the self, it's really the biodegrading of the self, is very much ignored, feared, and fought against in this culture. And I mean, amongst my liberal community, biodegradability is really important, but not when it comes to our own bodies or our families or anything else like that. And so it really does inhibit any kind of maturity process because it's something that we just can't comfortably accept. And yeah, our culture in a certain sense is dying now, but we're so terrified of it that the fight is almost a primal hysteria that's emerging to try to make America great again, or make it like the 60s again, or make it whatever. But yeah, these patterns of dissolution and rebirth are endless, and we have virtually no skills to deal with it in this culture.
Right. Yeah, so the line that comes to mind there is from my 10th grade English class, the Dylan Thomas poem, "Do not go gentle into that good night." Or is it good
right,
night?
that's that basic thing of and you see it all the time in the paper, and she lost a fight with cancer, but she fought to the end. And it's there's a thing that I've been thinking about a lot, that the old live with one foot in the land of the dead and one foot in the land of the living, and they live in the midst of unremitting grief. And there's a certain tragedy in the human condition that has always been here. I mean, I've been reading massive amounts of stuff about ancient Rome and Athens, and the patterns are exactly the same. The political arguments are the same. The stupid decisions are the same. It's just not that different at all. So there's this constant recurring tragedy dynamic that I could only be as poignantly aware of once I reached this age. And so how do you come to terms with that, where you feel this grief that's in the world, this tragedy that's always there, and yet come to terms with that without becoming bitter or cynical or hopeless and despairing? There's some other way through it to this sort of other state, which, Václav Havel talked about it quite a bit, and he said it's a certain kind of hope, but he said it's not optimism. It's not that sort of saccharine kind of belief that everything's going to turn out like a Disney film or something. This kind of hope also has incorporated into it that tragedy and the biodegrading process and the ending, and it's got this sort of patient, simple endurance that goes over time. Not an endurance and I'm fighting against this thing, but simply an equanimity of a sort where you've allowed yourself to feel that grief and that death and that pain and biodegrading and what it means, and you come to an acceptance of balance with it. And it's not so terrifying anymore after that. It's just different. And I rarely hear anybody talk about hope in that sense. There doesn't seem to be much understanding of it, and it ties back into something I heard Jacques Cousteau say 30 years ago in an interview that stuck in my mind because I didn't understand it. He was talking about the necessity for ecological reclamation of the Mediterranean, and this woman was interviewing him. She was in her 30s and said, but do you think you'll win? And he looked at her with complete shock, and he paused for a minute. He was wordless, and then he goes, one doesn't do it because one thinks one will win. One does it because it's in one's nature to do it. And she completely couldn't understand what he was saying. But I looked at his face and I thought, oh, there's something he knows that I need to understand. And so I've thought about it for, 30 years, and it's only now that I'm really starting to grasp. He was talking about that same kind of hope Václav Havel was, but from a different orientation.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. It seems like, we've stumbled onto something that just seems so core in talking about health of any sort, is just naming and facing the mortality of both, I guess, the mortality and the change that happens with life. None of us get out alive, and that's just a matter-of-fact thing.
We're all suffering from a terminal sexually transmitted disease.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a beautiful trip.
It can be, and sometimes it's very difficult and very dark, and it's very hard to make it through, where, all of us end up in dark places where we can't seem to find an opening, an avenue to move through it, and we're forced back into ourself. And not everybody survives that moment in time, and ultimately none of us survive it, because I know that as death approaches, everybody is forced to deal with a lot of things like that. Only at this point you can't make up, well, I'm going to get better and I'll get through this. How much, you can't do it forever. There's certain times where you get to where that heroic impulse just simply is useless. And the part of the self that is driven to ensure survival and life, it can't do its function anymore. It's over. And so you're faced with some sort of a shift in the self, which there's very little information on, and most of it tends to be extremely grandiose. But even the tiny movements of life at adolescence, middle age, and old age shifts, for instance, we hit that same aversion of that same thing. And even little things in our life, when major obstacles occur that we can't use old patterns for, it happens again. So somehow there's some teaching in those moments of lostness and darkness that are really ignored. In the United States, the solution for depression is antidepressants, not going into the darkness and finding out what soul teaching it has in it for who we're meant to be.
Mm. Right. That's a potent reframe. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome. That's one of the difficult things, and one of the real negative aspects of fundamentalist rationality has been its abandonment of the soul. And psychology itself has abandoned the soul. And so in America, we're caught in this cycle of this belief that every one of us deserves to live a life in which we never experience any wounds. And if we do, it was our parents' fault, or it was the person who raped us, or the person who beat us up, or the person who threw us into jail, or the drunk driver who ran into us, or on and on and on and on. But the thing that's missing is the question of what is the teaching in this for my soul? Why did my soul need to have this experience in order for me to become myself? And I worked for 15 years as a psychotherapist, mostly with people diagnosed schizophrenic or borderline personality. And for somebody whose mother put them in the oven to bake out the devils, there is no way you can tell that person, the 4-year-old in them will never understand, if you say, well, mommy had something wrong with her brain, and she was just really sad, and therefore she did that. That makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's turned into a more mythological context of the soul teaching that was involved, then all of a sudden it begins to make sense, and it can be accepted in a way it could never have been accepted if it was kept in that reductive framework. For instance, my mother got pregnant at 17. Her family were born-again Christians, very prominent. It was horrible, and she hated me growing in her body every second that I did. And after I was born, I was the symbol of the thing that had ruined her life. And so when she said to me, I love you, what she meant was I hate you. Right? Mm. But when I went to see my paternal grandmother, when she said I love you, what she meant was I love you. And so from the beginning of my life, I learned that form and essence are not related. Mm. Right? So I began to look at the meaning inside things rather than the surface of things. So that in and of itself inculcated in me a very extreme sensitivity to slight shifts of meaning, because my mother was schizophrenic and you could never tell when she was going to get weird. So I learned to pay really acute attention to slight shifts of breathing, our tone of voice, our movement of body, or all of this. And that, my entire work has come out of that sensitivity to slight shifts of meaning. So if I held it in a strict psychological sense, I would feel like my life had been ruined because of the hatred of my mother toward me from the moment I was born. And yeah, it did have massive effects that have been difficult, but yet at the same time, all of the work that I've done came out of that particular sequence of events. And, you know, how hard it is to honor these most important of our teachers. So, but changing it into a more perspective of that I could have only done my soul work if that had happened, it shifts the dynamic out of the victim position into one in which a great deal of empowerment resides. And that's something our culture has lost sight of, the very fact that this is a journey of becoming the self that all of us are engaged in, and without that concept of soul emergence, of the darknesses that are necessary for the soul to become itself, I mean, we're simply lost in taking antidepressants and an endless loop of psychotherapy that replays the victim dynamic over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder if I can ask a kind of more personal question that relates
Sure.
to this part of the story. I wonder if there are plants that you've worked with to help with your own healing, either of that story that you just shared about your childhood and your relationship with your mother, or if there are just plant allies that have aided you in that, in your own personal healing in a really meaningful way for you.
Well, yeah, both of those. It's like in working with people who have been labeled schizophrenic, one of the only ways that I found they could truly be healed is if they reconnected their tiniest selves, the infant, the young child in themselves, back to the wildness of the world. Once they did that, there was this tremendous repository of soul or myth that began to flow into them, that began to provide that sort of nurturing that they hadn't gotten in their families. And they bypassed the human world with that whole dynamic of the victimization cycle. And so one of the primary things that I began to do when I was doing apprenticeships or even doing workshops is I would, send people out and say, just walk until a plant catches your attention and then sit down with that one. I mean, it's the most simple thing and yet difficult for people to see. Of all of the millions of plants that surround us in a woodland, why would one capture your attention more than any of the others? Mm-hmm. It's because it's responding, the need in you and the plant are responding to each other in a certain kind of way that pulls you to each other, just like you might be pulled in attraction to someone that you want to become lovers with, and you never know how that's going to happen. And for me, my immersion into the plant world occurred in exactly that way, of being ill in my body and wandering in the woods and coming upon Osha and being completely taken by this plant I didn't even really know that happened to be perfect for the physical disease I was suffering. But yet at the same time, when I ate the raw herb, the root, and took it inside my body, it wasn't just this physical thing like a pharmaceutical. I was aware of this living being inside of me that was responding on multiple levels to the struggles I was having. That sensitivity that had developed in me, was able to really perceive that sort of living entity inside me. And as I began to walk through the world and work with more plants, there were quite a number of them that I would stumble upon, as anybody does when they walk through a healthy wilderness. I don't think there's one of us that haven't walked in woods and come unexpectedly upon a great tree in a clearing, and we just stop and we're overtaken by this feeling of awe almost, and this gasping of breathing in of, oh my God, or this great rock formation, or something that moves us in that way. And in that moment, something from out there comes inside of us, and we begin to feel that we're not alone. We're not isolated in our own house, divorced from any meaningful contact with the living beings of the world with which we're surrounded. So for me, so many of the plants that I found in my early wanderings fulfilled that kind of function. And they were, just like Barbara McClintock talked about, her work with corn transposons and all of the corn that she grew, she said, each one of them is its own individual. They have their own life, their own hopes, their own dreams, their own struggles. And she said, as I worked with each one of them, it's like I became part of their world. My eye began to see inside their life. They were my friends. And really anybody that begins to work with the plant world in that way, that transcends that sort of dissociated stance, they begin to find out that they have personalities and lives and hopes and intelligence that they interact with, and pretty soon the long loneliness of the human species ends. We're pulled into a different kind of world, one that the rationalists just don't understand. So yeah, Osha was a big plant for me. Certain kind of skull caps that grew in the high mountains, aspens. There were so many of them that I was surrounded by that their medicine, not only of their bodies, but just of their spirits, became tremendously supportive of me becoming who I was meant to be and curing those old wounds that were inside me. I think the majority of community herbalists in the Northern Hemisphere that I've met have had some experience like that. I mean, that's one of the reasons I loved going to the International Herb Symposium, for instance, because I went to this place where the vast majority of people there had their life saved by a plant. And once that happens, nothing is ever the same again. It's just, you're different, and you can't ever really go back.
Mm-hmm. Wow, interesting. Yeah, it does seem like when I try to relate to who I was, in my early 20s, it's difficult. I remember that I had these certain values, but there's no way for me to step back into that worldview.
It's not really possible, but the interesting thing that I found is the tremendous amount of gratitude I have toward that younger self, because he had the courage to follow this thing that had touched him, that led him on this marvelous adventure that ultimately resulted in the life I have now. And without that moment of courage, or that stubbornness of his refusal to be subsumed back into that old frame completely, I could never have had the life I have now. And believe me, I would not ever want to have the life that that old world would have led to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that brings up something that I wanted to thank you personally for, which is this work that I've learned from you about working with inner children, various stages
Right.
of our development and our ego states, and it has been really profound in my own healing journey, and I've now started incorporating that into my healing work with clients, and
That's great. That's great.
It's really tremendous. Being able to. Yeah, I mean, I've just had some really cathartic experiences being able to relate, to the boy that the conversation that when my dad told me he was moving out and my folks were getting divorced.
Right.
I've been able to restore my relationship with that boy and to comfort and nourish him.
That's great.
Through the trauma, and I love, both times that I've had the opportunity to study with you, you've used this term that it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And it's had a profound impact on me, and I'm really grateful. All of your work has had a profound impact on me in validating the invisibles that I had never articulated.
Right. I'm really glad to hear that. One of the most difficult things about the rationalist viewpoint is the belief that all of us are composed of a single I, a single ego state. Mm-hmm. But what's really true is people are composed of multiple personality structures, and all of us have had that experience. And I think that's one of the things that most frightens people when their psychological structure begins to fragment, is other parts of their self that seem to have an independent ability for action begin intruding upon their consciousness, and they start to feel crazy because they didn't understand that they were multiple consciousnesses and all sort of enclosed in this skin, And there's a great book by James Hillman called Revisioning Psychotherapy or Revisioning Psychology that talks about this in more detail than I think I've ever read anyplace else. And one of the fascinating points he's made, which is something I knew, but I didn't consciously have a structure to talk about it. He said, at the moment of animation, we enter again a polytheistic universe. And so as soon as, for instance, we have an experience of a plant as a living being that's intelligent and has its own hopes and dreams and functions, we've reanimated the world outside of us, and we immediately then begin walking back into a polytheistic frame of reference. And the same thing happens, he said one of the great things about Freud, whose work I actually don't agree with that much, but one of the great things about Freud is when he came up with the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego, he basically said we were composed of multiple consciousness modules. And in that sense, he began to reanimate our interior world. And Jung took it even further. And so it's this kind of crack that was inserted. So we had the sort of monocentric edifice that had been imposed on all of us with Christianity, and then again with rationality. But these things began to create cracks in that edifice. And Lovelock's conception of Gaia, of the earth as this living being, Gaia, it reanimated the earth in a sense. And so you see a lot of the tremendous rage against the Gaia theory are against these internal structure of multiple consciousness modules and ego states, or multiple personality structure that we all have. It's this tremendous fear of leaving that monocentric orientation in which control is possible. But once you start to understand that our interior world is just as complex of an ecosystem as outside, not just physically but psychologically, we begin to reclaim these parts of ourselves that have been abandoned or damaged or locked away, that over time tend to become hostile to us because they're so suppressed. And that reclamation of the self then we start to find that, as I said, that it's never too late to have a happy childhood, but we start to kind of reclaim that 360-degree radiance that we had as small children. And we live in an animate universe in which we're interactive with everything. So I'm really glad that was something that helped me, and I think that a lot of the reclamation of our world begins with that simple step, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's had a big impact on me personally. And as you're talking about that quote about the polytheist, it seems to me like there's the history of herbs who is frequently held it are the witches.
Well, there's that dynamic. I mean, really, it's just people that live in close contact with the earth. I mean, you know, although the concept of witchcraft is fairly widely spread in cultures around the world, in general, you know, there's a certain conception of witches as engaging in sort of things that would harm other life forms, you know, other people in the community or whatever. Mm-hmm. But if you sort of get rid of that concept and you look at it, this dynamic of people that live close to the earth and have this conception of everything as alive, each of them then sort of becomes a channel for some of that life force to flow through them into the human community. And no matter how much people in the Western world have tried to suppress that, it's not something that can be suppressed. It's exactly like weeds growing through a sidewalk. It keeps breaking through this sort of enforced, you know, monocentric rigidity and emerging of its own accord back into the human species. And those people have kept it alive even though they've been marginalized as astrologers or tarot readers or herbalists or whatever. But there's something, that stuff remains because it's one of the few accesses to soul that people in the Western cultures have. And at this point, it's starting to really break through that old rigidified framework and blossom everywhere. And so I tend to think of it as more, I like the term wise women are, you know, the people that are into simples, that it's got less of a edge to it than witches do. And
right.
Yeah, it's just my personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, you know, I heard that translation in the Bible that says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," the actual translation was, "Thou shalt not suffer a caster of evil spells to live." Mm-hmm. And it makes a huge difference in the way it's interpreted at that point in time.
Well, it wasn't the witches who wrote the story about them being evil casters.
No, it wasn't. I mean, there was a big conflict between, as Christianity emerged, and the old polytheistic framework of the Roman Empire that came before it. And, you know, like a lot of things, we threw out the baby with the bathwater in that deal, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. I feel like there's a good sense of completeness here. I wonder if there's anything else that you feel, any final parting thought that you would want to share with younger herbalists or folks new to herbalism in terms of, I don't know, any particular message or sharing from your heart.
You know, one of the things I constantly talk about is, you know, James Hillman said we've lost the response of the heart to what's presented to the senses. And I always think that the first act of decolonization, because people need to realize we're the longest colonized. You know, they tend to think of imperialism and first world countries' colonization processes as only happening to other cultures out there. But in fact, we were colonized long ago. And the first step to the decolonization of the soul really is to reclaim the feeling sense. Like, how does this restaurant feel? How does this book feel? How does this job feel? How does this piece of furniture feel? How does this, you know, school feel? Everything over and over and over again. because each of us are born with a sense of rightness, that our feeling self, it enables us to tell the difference in the meanings we encounter, and certain meanings have a resonance for us. We know where our sense of rightness tells us where true gold is to be found, and reclaiming that and beginning to follow it is really an important thing. And so I always like to finish by saying, always trust your feeling sense, and don't let anybody outside of you convince you that it's not real, because that is the first step in freedom and the decolonization of the self.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your time today.
You're welcome, Garlic. Thanks for having me on.
The seeds are lying dormant, it will never end.
And that was Stephen Buhner, herbalist, activist, author, visionary, and more. And I'm your host, Garlic, with the Living Medicine Project. I'd like to end this podcast, like a lot of activist meetings, by talking about action items. And there's two from this interview that I want to highlight. Specifically, they're two of the exercises that Stephen referenced throughout the interview. The first is to take yourself for a walk, just an aimless wander until you come across a plant that seems somehow spectacular to you, somehow attractive or draws you in. And then spend some time with that plant. Introduce yourself, let yourself start to develop a relationship and see what happens. And the other exercise is what I call the how does it feel exercise that he was talking about at the end. And for this, I encourage you to take a couple of moments every day to just tune in to the things that are around you. Just one thing at a time, and ask yourself how it feels. And even if you don't get an answer or it doesn't make sense, the exercise is about asking the question. Because just like a muscle, as you exercise your feeling sense, it will get stronger, and those answers will come. And they'll come with many layers of meaning. These are two exercises which have had a big impact on me, and I hope that you find fruit in them. And so that's it for this edition of Herbalism is Activism. I am your host, Garlic, wishing you strength and wisdom in your stories of healing, justice, resistance, and change.
Willie says, when you say you are afraid, I understand. In a place where one can rarely smell the land, but the ocean breeze still blows here that will never end. The seeds are lying dormant, it will never end. Willie says,